Good evening. It is good to be with you tonight. We do have a good number with us. We're glad that you're here. I just heard a moment ago that our brother Robert Moore had a stent placed in his leg today. That would be his second procedure, second surgery. And I certainly want to remember Robert in our prayers. And also it's good to see, as was mentioned in our prayer just now, Ann with us tonight. Most of you probably know she fell on the ice here Sunday and broke her elbow. And unfortunately, you're going to have surgery on that elbow this coming Monday. And we want to remember her in a very special way in our prayers. Also, Roger and Fran are not able to be with us tonight, and they send their regards to us. And certainly, we pray that they are feeling better soon. It's good to see most of you back that were not able to be here this past Lord's Day because of the snow and ice. And we're glad that that weather's behind us. It's time to go fishing now. So at least that's how it feels when you step outside. And I'm ready. Kay, it's good to see you back in class tonight. And I'm glad you and Tom come. Well, I guess it's good to have Tom too. Yeah, it's good. Good. Genesis chapter 22 is what we'll be studying tonight. As a child, when you go to Bible class and the teacher has a flannel board or chalkboard or the coloring book or whatever they're using to teach and illustrate their class, you learn a lot of fascinating and interesting stories. And when you grow up going to Bible class and hearing those fascinating and interesting stories, you grow up familiar with those fascinating, interesting stories without recognizing that they fit into a much larger picture. And in fact, the more you study the Bible, the more you look at it in detail, the more you see in its individual parts that it's driving toward one central point in time. Everything in the Bible is moving from the beginning in Genesis to the time we reach the Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John to that scene outside the city of Jerusalem at Golgotha, the little mount there, or a hill outside of the city of Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified. And it's amazing when you study the Bible in that light. Recognizing, beginning, for example, in Genesis 3:15, as we've already noted, that God had promised, once sin entered into the picture, that he would send a deliverer. And that this deliverer would come through the seed of woman. And how that began to unfold. And then we meticulously followed the generations. We keep up with who beget who beget who beget who, and so on and so forth. Many times when you're reading in the Old Testament, it's difficult to understand how what you're reading fits into that picture. But trust me, everything, every bit of it falls in its right and proper place in that overall picture of that cross where Jesus ultimately paid the price for our sins. It really began in Genesis with the perfect world. It began with God making paradise and intending man to live there forever with him, communing with him. But man decided to rebel and man sinned. And as a consequence, because of his love, God, of course, brought about a plan of salvation. That's very evident in our reading tonight. This is one of those exceptional cases where when you read it, you just see it, even if you're not that familiar with this scarlet thread, as it's sometimes referred to, that runs from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Everything, of course, pointing to Jesus, forward and backward. But here in Genesis chapter 22, we're reading something that's just, on many levels, challenging, mind-boggling, fascinating. This is just incredible what we're going to read tonight. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, And he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, the lad, and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together. They came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." So he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horn. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. And then we have what would appear to be a parenthetical note to get us ready for the next narrative we're going to read. It came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, "Indeed, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Huz, his firstborn, Buz, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlap, and Bethuel begat Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah." So we have that parenthetical note, which again is preparation for what we're about to read. I don't know how you respond to this when you read it, but there are several things that perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, childhood flannel graph lessons in a Bible class. Maybe you have a picture depicting this event in your Bible. A lot of people have pictures in their Bible, and I remember we had one, my mother probably still has it, a big family Bible that sat on the coffee table in the living room, collected a lot of dust, but we would open it sometimes to look at the pictures in it. And there was some really interesting artwork from many years ago. I'll never forget the picture of Abraham and Isaac, and of course him raising the hand to slay his son. Most of those pictures have Abraham with a little boy, and he's bound and he's placed on the altar, and he's about to take his life, and God stops him. There's a whole lot to be said about this, but I'm just kind of setting the stage and trying to get your thoughts as you heard the reading and you read along with me, how you respond to that. The first thought I have, of course, is that James says in James chapter 2 that Abraham was justified based upon this event. You see how that by works Abraham was justified and not by faith only, when he had offered his son Isaac upon the altar. And you see then how by works he was justified and not by faith only. That, of course, in the language, in the English reading as we understand it, confuses our mind because in Romans chapter 4, Paul used the very same passage from Genesis. Abraham believed God. It was accounted him for righteousness. And he used it to make the point that Abraham was justified apart from works. And that, of course, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, is confusing to a lot of people. But the confusion is cleared when we understand the works that was being referred to in Romans chapter 4 were works related to the law of Moses, a law which was not even in existence when what we've just read occurred. The law of Moses had not been given. Moses had not been born. The Ten Commandments had not been given. So Abraham was not justified by that law or the works of that law. But he was justified by obedient faith. And that's how James uses the expression. You see then how by works a man is justified and not by faith only. And that's why I think many people are confused about it. When you think about his faith, it is tremendous. Mentioned it last week, I believe, how challenging it is oftentimes for us to believe God will provide us something, give us something, or we ask God for something, and God delays giving us that thing for an extended period of time, and we eventually just give up. We decide, well, maybe God's not going to give me that thing after all, or maybe God forgot about it, or maybe God changed his mind, or maybe God never heard me to start with. And so we just try to write it off because it doesn't happen on our time scale. I think Abraham and Sarah obviously had reached that point more than once in their time, waiting for God to give them a son of promise. But God did keep that promise. And now Isaac is born, and Isaac is his son, his beloved son, the son whom you love. And God tells him to do the unthinkable. Now, when we say it's the unthinkable, I think it's important to understand that at this time even, in this part of the world especially, there were pagans who already were offering children as sacrifice to their God. So this was not a concept that Abraham would have, where did you get that idea, God? He wouldn't have asked that question because he probably saw other people doing something like that and was well aware of that abhorrent behavior. He might have been surprised that God would ask him to do that and to do that with his son, no doubt. Well, but that's the amazing thing about this whole narrative to me. I'm sure Abraham had 1,000 different questions. But it's not recorded if he ever asked any of those questions. Did y'all remember hearing Abraham question God about any of this? At what point did Abraham say, but wait a minute, God, I thought you said, or wait a minute, God, why would you ask me to? Or, God, I don't understand. That just don't make it. I don't see any connection between that and where did Abraham reason that way with God ever in this entire episode? Instead, what we read is that early the next morning, he saddled his donkey, took his servants, split the wood, took the fire with him, and went on his way, waiting for God to show him exactly which mountain he was to approach and therefore offer Isaac as a sacrifice. That fascinates me as we think about that level of faith. And you think about this. It's this kind of faith that is required of someone when they hear Jesus saying, for example, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. So many people hear that and say, wait a minute, I don't see any connection between being baptized and having my sins forgiven. Have you ever had anyone say something like that to you? I have many times. Now, if we had the faith of Abraham, would we reason that way? And isn't that the challenge? And we could I'm just using baptism. We could use any command of God. But if you look at any command that God has issued, it comes back down to this faith that Abraham possessed, which is well on display here before us. God said, do it. He just did it. He didn't ask why. He didn't argue. He didn't, don't make any sense to me. He just did it. And of course, in the doing of it, there's a lot to be said about it. When you think about his faith was very strong. He believed that God would provide, and that's what he named this place. The Lord will provide. He believed that God would provide a sacrifice. Can you imagine your son, daddies, saying to you, and you know what you're about to do, that's what you think you're going to do, looking at you and saying, Daddy, where are we going to get the lamb for the offering? Do you suppose Abraham had tears in his eyes when he responded? I don't know. I know that the Lord did say to Abraham, you take your son, the son that you love, and you offer him as a sacrifice. And so I'm imagining there was a lot of emotion welling up in Abraham's heart. Probably even to the point of almost being overcome. But isn't it amazing? The Lord will provide him a lamb. And did God provide a lamb? Indeed he did. But God will provide a lamb. And so he had faith that God's going to take care of this. We also know, because in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, we learn that Abraham had faith in something else. If I actually go through with this, and Isaac is the sacrifice, I'm not worried about losing Isaac. In fact, notice what he said to his servants. You stay here, and we're going to go yonder place. We're going to worship, and we will return to you. He had absolute confidence that both of them will be returning. And yet, what's he doing? He has a knife with him. He has the wood. He has the fire. He has every intention of doing what God told him to do. Had God not stopped him, no doubt he would have done it. And so he's fully confident that even if I go through with this, in fact, the Hebrew writer said, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. Again, just stop it. I can't help but make note here in the book of Hebrews, how the Hebrew writer speaks of the event as though it actually occurred, as though he actually offered up, because in reality he did. He didn't actually jab the knife into him and bleed him out. I mean, he didn't do that, but it's as much as if he had done it. He was literally in the motion to take care of what God told him, and God stopped him. And so the Hebrew writer speaks of it as though he actually did it. When he was tried, he offered up Isaac, and he that received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That's the key. Abraham had absolute confidence. I don't care what happened when we get up there. It doesn't matter. Because God's told me, and I believe God, that this son, this is the son who will begin this long expansion of human beings that will be brought into the world that ultimately will bring about the Messiah. And I know that he's the chosen one. And so it doesn't matter what happens when we get to the mountain. It's irrelevant, because this is the seed of promise. And that's what the Hebrew writer seemed to be taking note of. Again, in Isaac shall your seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Hebrews 11:17-19. That's fascinating to me. Abraham didn't waver. He didn't hesitate. He didn't question. He didn't argue. He didn't have to. He just heard God tell him to do something, and he did it. That's the kind of faith that we all are challenged to have. And I know that our faith is weak. I know that our faith stumbles from time to time, and we're tempted, and all those things enter the equation. But this is why studies like this are so important. It reminds us this is the kind of faith that we are challenged to possess. Y'all mind me reading something to you from Josephus? Huh?
Read slow.
Okay, if I read slow, but it's kind of lengthy. I mean, really, I like this kind of stuff. I mean, you may not like it, but Josephus is not inspired, not a part of the Bible. He was a first century Jewish historian, and he recorded for us much of Jewish tradition. And that's all we're reading here is Jewish tradition. And so we read it in that light. We don't read it as scripture. It's not Bible. It's not inspired. But it is interesting to see, at least in the first century, 2,000 years ago, what Jewish people thought about these events. And some of the information they've recorded for us. Some of it probably embellished. Some of it probably fake news. I don't know. It probably was all real. Who knows how much of this we can trust. But it's just fascinating. I'll read slow. And And I'll just let you hear for yourself. I'm going to pick up in the middle. I can't read all of this. It's very long. But this is concerning Isaac, the legitimate son of Abraham. And what was said is kind of a lengthy introduction. So I'll get right to the point. As soon as the altar was prepared, and Abraham had laid on the wood, and all things were entirely ready, he said to his son, O son, I poured out a vast number of prayers that I might have thee for my son. When thou wast come into the world, there was nothing that could contribute to thy support for which I was not greatly solicitous, nor anything wherein I thought myself happier than to see thee grown up to man's estate, and that I might leave thee at my death the successor to my dominion. But since it was by God's will that I became thy father, and it is now his will that I relinquish thee, bear this consecration to God with a generous mind. For I resign thee up to God, who has thought fit now to require this testimony of honor to himself on account of the favors he hath conferred on me, in being to me a supporter and defender. Accordingly thou, my son, wilt now die, not in any common way of going out of the world, but sent to God, the Father of all men, beforehand by thy own Father, in the nature of a sacrifice. Now he says more, and I'll just stop here, but when you read what we just read in Genesis, all you read is Isaac asked the question, where we're going to get the lamb. God will provide. The next thing, Abraham builds the altar, lays the wood in order, and binds Isaac, puts him on the altar. Something was said at some point. There was some more exchange. Moses, the Holy Spirit, did not record that for us. Now, whether or not what I read to you has any validity or merit to it at all, I couldn't say. I'm just telling you that perhaps it's Jewish fabrication, Jewish legend, but this is how they tried to fill in these blanks. Now, maybe there's some merit to it. I couldn't say. But I will read this response by Isaac. Again, Jewish history, Jewish tradition. And this is what the Jews thought about Isaac. Now, Isaac was of such a generous disposition as became the son of such a father, and was pleased with this discourse from his father, and said that he was not worthy to be born at first, if he should reject the determination of God and of his father, and should not resign himself up readily to both their pleasures, since it would have been unjust if he had not obeyed, even if his father alone had so resolved. So he went immediately to the altar to be sacrificed. And the deed had been done if God had not opposed it, for he called loudly to Abraham by his name, and forbade him to slay his son, and said it was not out of a desire of human blood, etc. I mean, I don't want to read all of this, but I find that interesting. I mean, no doubt people are trying to come to terms with what transpired on an emotional and a personal basis between father and son. But here's the question. How old was Isaac? Well, we're not told exactly. Josephus here says that he was 33 years old. Now, my son, who's not quite 30, you're not, are you? Told me tonight that my granddaughter took a couple of steps for the first time today. She's a sweet little girl. Stubborn. I don't know why she hasn't started running around the yard yet, but she's taking her time. But when I think about all those pictures of the little boys that were bound, some of them are maybe Robert's age, 5, 6 years old maybe, 3 or 4 years old. I don't know, maybe a boy that size could carry a good bundle of wood up for the sacrifice. I don't know. It's not likely. It's very likely that he was a grown man. And these two grown men, Abraham, an old man, 133 years old, and a 33-year-old son. Both of these are very grown, mature men, and both of them are going to this willingly. Abraham, of course, by faith, and Isaac, no doubt, the same. Now, when I mentioned earlier about God's plan from the very foundation of the world, Do you suppose God was thinking about Calvary when he had Abraham do? Of course. Now, some people get carried away. Maybe they have a point, maybe they don't have a point. But they try to, the mountains of Moriah. Where was that? Well, that was eventually going to be Jerusalem. And that's where eventually the temple was built. And my parents have been there. They've even been to the site, supposedly, by tradition, where this is the very rock where Abraham brought Isaac to offer him as a... And the Muslims, by the way, will cut your head off if you try to get near that rock anymore. But they also respect that rock, at least that sacred place. They might blow up, I don't know, they cut you off, but something in their peaceful religion. But nevertheless, that's still there. And so many would say, well, this is in Jerusalem. After 3 days, Abraham found the place. And Jesus was in the heart of the earth. I don't know. There's a whole lot, I think, more of that being made than should, perhaps. It is interesting. Think about the 3 days. There is the wood that Isaac himself bore to that site. Burton Kaufman said that the site was Golgotha itself, where Abraham took Isaac and offered him. And you say, well, how could that? Well, because it's God. God told him where he wanted this to take place. Do you think God would have chosen that I don't know. But why would he tell him to go to that general area if not to that specific place? I mean, maybe Brother Kaufman has a point to be made there. It's something to think about. Maybe he went to the very scene that eventually would be called Golgotha, or the place of a skull, where he would offer his son Isaac, perhaps. And Isaac did bear that wood himself. Jesus bore his own wood to that very place. And of course, there is that Jewish historian with all that rich Jewish history, which you can believe as much of it as you choose, reject all of it, whatever. But it does remind us that when Jesus did go to Golgotha, he did go willingly. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life, that I might take it again. No man takes it from me. I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it again. This commandment have I received of my Father. What was the first thing God said when he broke his silence regarding Jesus when he came up from the waters of the Jordan? And what did God tell Abraham to do with this son? And how did he describe him? His beloved son. His beloved son. The son that you love. So when the rocks split apart and the veil of the temple was rent and the earth was shaking and the sun literally refused to shine and dead people got up and started walking around, do you suppose it had anything to do with God the Father giving up his Son for us? Do you suppose there's any possible connection between what no doubt was tearing the heart of God out as he's offering his own Son for us? And how do we respond to that offer to us? There's something else I want to mention before our time runs completely out, because I keep interrupting me with comments, so I'll try to hurry up and talk over you. In verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, the lad, and I will go yonder and worship." I've had a lot of people tell me, and I'm sure you have heard it too, I didn't get anything out of that church service. Let's think about that. Just break that down a minute. I know you've heard that. How's that typically used? What's typically being said or critiqued when someone says that? Preacher was boring. Songs were pitched too low. Preacher preached too long. It could mean a number of things, but typically I've heard that used by individuals who attend services of a very different nature than what they might experience here. Maybe more of a Pentecostal type flavor, where I saw something on Facebook. It just popped in my head. I'm sorry, but Ron Nation, did y'all see that post from Ron Nation of that little bird with the feathers all fluffy? And he said, this is the bird of a Pentecostal before church, and this is the bird of Pentecost, and the feathers were every... Anyway, it was... Ronnie's mean like that. I'm not like that. But anyway, no, I'm just saying that there are a lot of people who look at this, and I know people because I study with them every week. And I've been to their church building. I've been to funerals there. And I'm telling you, these are elaborate structures with elaborate lighting system and sound system and professional singers and guitarists and drummers. And I mean, they've got everything. And they've got music ministers. And I mean, these are professional people that are there to worship. And so they come here and we're singing, all of us. Some of us better than others. We're all singing. I didn't get anything out of that. I'm saying all that not to pick on anybody, but to illustrate what's really revealed here about the true nature of what is worship. What is worship? And what I'm saying is, the average person today says worship is something that I enjoy going to and listening to and being entertained with. They wouldn't use the word entertained. That sounds disrespectful. But you strip it away, that's what they mean. It makes goosebumps come on the back of their neck. Or, they cry or they laugh or, what? They get something entertaining out of it. So they're going to get something out of it. What is worship? You say, well, worship is recognizing the greatness of God. It is. But ultimately, we can strip it down to what we've just read here in verse 5. What is worship? It is submission to the will of God. That's what worship is. And for someone to say, I don't see nothing wrong with, and you fill in the blank, when it comes to matters of worship, I don't see anything wrong with that. Why can't we just do this or do that or do that? I mean, the very point of worship is to submit our will to His will. And so the very first question anyone who's going to worship God needs to ask is, what would He have me do? And how would He have me do it? Not, I'm going to do what I want because I like it this way or I like it that way. But worship is about submission to the will of God. I don't believe Abraham intended to go to that mountain thinking I'm going to go away with my feathers all fluffy and come back with them all, blurted out or because I'm going to have a good time. I don't think he looked at it that way at all. He was probably dreading every step along the way. Thinking, I'm going to have to go do some terrible thing here. But nevertheless, that was what Abraham called worship. I'm going there to worship. And that's what they did. Glenn Beck had a comment. Sir?
You've already said they got it.
Oh.
I was going to do the interpretation. I didn't get anything out of it, which is translated, I was not entertained.
Oh, that's my sermon you're talking about. Okay. Okay. Any questions or comments about Abraham offering his son? Now I know. I might have told y'all this, but I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was like 4:30 in the morning, and my brother and I were leaving. I don't even remember the name of the village. It was the most interior village I had ever visited in Honduras. It was on the Mosquito Coast side of that country. And we had gone to, it was a place where you had to take a four-wheel drive about 20 miles from a cow town on the coast, 20 miles outside of that. Then you got off of that pig trail and you followed a human trail about 7 miles into the interior. This was cool. I've never seen so many stars in all of my life. I'll never forget the night we got there. I was just amazed how many stars you could see. There wasn't an electric light for hundreds of miles, I guess, anywhere to be seen. It was really neat. But we were coming back after about 3 days of working with this small village. And it was about 4:30 in the morning. We had our backpacks loaded and we were walking and we were tired. And my brother started this crazy argument that he has about God and his foreknowledge and what God knows. And I was trying to correct him. And I've been trying to correct him all of his life. And we're with a bunch of Mosquito Indians. And that's all they spoke was Mosquito Indian. And we had about 3 or 4 others who spoke Mosquito Indian and Spanish. And then there was me and my brother, and we spoke Southern English. And we were yelling at each other to the top of our lungs, idiot, stupid, bonehead, you know what you're talking about. And they were looking at us occasionally like, are y'all okay? Yeah, we're fine. We're having a brotherly conversation, can't you tell? But I never forget my brother. I cited this passage to my brother because my brother said, God knows everything you're going to do before you ever do it. He knows exactly what's going to transpire because he may be right. Y'all going to run me out of town. Maybe everything's going to happen. It's already happened. We just don't know it yet. But from God's standpoint, I mean, what's time? It's nothing. So God sees the beginning, He sees the end, He sees everything. It's just right there. And we're stuck in the middle somewhere, and we're trying to figure out where we are. And God's outside of that. He's outside of time. He's not bound by time and space. So anyway, maybe everything's already happened that's going to ever happen. So, maybe my brother's right, but I just thought, they don't make any sense to me because God made us free moral agents, and it would have a lot of things have to be explained. And if you're going to have that degree of foreknowledge, certainly God can look into the future and see what He wants to see. I mean, He's God, right? No problem with that. But I cited this, and my brother said something that I guess makes more sense than anything else from someone in his camp that's wrong about God's foreknowledge. And what? And that is, now I know experientially. Because I said, well, what does it mean? Was God lying when He said, now I know? I mean, He's told Abraham, now I know. Did He not know before? Abraham did this. And He said, no, He knew He would do this. He knew what Abraham would do. But now He could say, I know it from experience. I said, why didn't He just say it? Now I know from experience what you did. He just said, now I know. Anyway, chapter 23, y'all are going to get really upset with me. I can tell by the look on your face you think I'm weird. But these are some interesting questions that sometimes brothers who are preachers and have nothing better to do besides walk and breathe really hard and argue. That was a long walk that day. Any other questions or comments? You remember who Nahor was? That's all you need to know, right? He was mentioned earlier. His other brother died. And, of course, he took his son, Lot, to raise. And now he's heard. He did not have Facebook. He did not have Instagram. He did not have a cell phone. So I'm sure some traveling group came along and said this about your brother. Is there a name in this list that stands out to you? Rebecca. That's a pretty name, isn't it? And so Rebecca is introduced to us. But something else has to take place first, and this is a very difficult chapter. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up, bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and he spoke with them, saying, It is your wish that I bury my dead. If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and meet with Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price as property for a burial place among you. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered at the gate of his city, saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, If you will give it, please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. So the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave, which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within the surrounding border, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went in at the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as property for a burial place. 127 years old, and she died. That was a long time to live. Was Sarah a good woman? That was a timid answer. She was a good woman. Was she sinless? Have we read any mistakes that she might have made? We've read a few of them, haven't we? Did her faith ever waver? Indeed it did. Sarah, like us, those who strive to live faithfully, will have our ups and our downs, our highlights, and our not so good moments in our life. But Sarah lived a rich and full life. And she was a righteous woman. And she died. Everyone dies. No one escapes death. Even these great men and women of faith, these heroes of faith, they died. There were two human beings that we know of that did not die. Why they did not die, we do not know. But we do know that the Hebrew writer reminds us it is appointed unto men once to die. And after this, the judgment. It doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you're Oriental, if you're rich, if you're poor, if you're educated, if you're bald-headed, if you got a lot of mess to deal with every day. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like or what you deal with every day. You're going to die. I'm going to die. Unless the Lord returns first, we're all going to die. I was at the doctor's office yesterday, and the lady who was taking my blood pressure, how do you take this as a compliment? She said, "You're in pretty good shape for somebody your age." That's the first time in my life someone's spoken to me that way. I did get the senior discount in the drive-thru at McDonald's recently again. That's the second time that's happened to me. And they didn't see me. Did they have cameras in the drive-thru? She just heard my voice. I said, "Did you see me?" She said, "I heard your voice, sir." I'm like, do I sound that old? Anyway, she asked me what I did for a living, and I told her. She said, "Oh, that's wonderful." She said, "I just want to live my life so I can go to heaven." I thought, well, that's really sweet of her to say that. And I said, well, that's a great and noble desire, and we should all have that desire. She said, "I don't want to die to get there." She said, "Maybe the Lord will just take me up when He comes." I said, well, maybe He will. Maybe He'll just take you up when He comes. And if He does come and we're still alive, He will take us up. And we won't go through the valley of the shadow of death. But if He does not, we certainly will. And should we be prepared for that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Any questions or comments about chapter 23? Chapter 24 is very lengthy, and I doubt we have time to get into it. Yes, Tommy?
You said that if man wants to die, but if the Lord comes, we won't die. Is that a statement that's either true or not true? If we just take it up.
The statement is not every person will die. It's appointed unto men once to die. It's just a general rule. And there's an exception, and Paul gave the exception, and that is if we're alive and remain, 1 Corinthians 15. So other than the exception, the rule is you're going to die. We're all going to die. And we don't know when, and we don't always know how. And so we need to be ready. But think about Abraham and what he must have had to deal with emotionally as he was offering the son of his love. What a tremendous narrative this is.